We both drove back to the station, handed in our gear, and changed. I could still smell the faint odor clinging to my uniform. I suppressed the urge to gag as I threw it back into my locker without any finesse, just wanting to get it off me. I changed into a pair of cut-off jean shorts and my UCSD hoodie. I bumped back into Felix on my way to my car. He was wearing that stupid Broncos windbreaker like it was his best suit. He looked almost as exhausted as me. We both exchanged a tired hey to each other. "I'm going to Norm's. You want to come? I'm buying." I tried to let out a chuckle, but it only came out as a weak exhale. "That old place? Just this once, I need a drink." I stammered out, trying to keep it together. Last thing I wanted was to put on the waterworks in front of him. Felix's gaze softened as he quieted for a moment. "Me too. Come on, Ash. I'll drive, alright?" I sniffed once and he put a hand on my back and gently ushered me to his truck. We didn't say much as we climbed into his truck and he started to drive me towards town. I gazed out the dim window into the dark outlines of the pines. My head pounded with the aftershock of pure adrenaline leaving my body. I clenched my fist tightly as I felt my hands continue to tremble. I let out a couple unsteady breaths to control my breathing. It helped a little. I finally mustered up what little confidence I had and turned towards Felix. His eyes were focused on the road, but I could tell he noticed with how tightly he clenched his jaw. He quickly cut me off before I could finish. "You have nothing to be sorry for." I let out a quiet sigh and let myself relax a little, not really in the mindset to argue with Felix. There was still one question that had been swirling in my mind. What was that? Felix's expression darkened as his eyes flickered to me and then back to the dimly lit road ahead. "Between you and me, I heard some whispers from the badge rangers about this." My brow furrowed as more questions flooded my brain. I turned my head and quietly asked him, "You knew about this?" He shook his head a few times. I thought it was a spike in chronic wastings or rabies or anything, just not that." I didn't know what to say, but my hand slid across the center console just short of touching him. I didn't know why. I just didn't want to feel alone after that. I just wanted to feel close to someone for a moment. I felt his hand squeeze my arm just for a second before he withdrew his hand. I retreated my hand back to my seat and stared ahead wordlessly. We both didn't say anything else the entire ride into town. The small town of Ravenwood was dead quiet in these later hours of the night. The only place that was still open was that shitty gas station at the edge of town, that Chinese takeout place that I never went to, and Norm's. The truck drove past the main street, if you could call it that, until we reached the edge of one of the last blocks before it turned into scattered neighborhoods. On the street corner was our destination, Norm's, the only place to get a drink besides the liquor store on the edge of town that closed after 7 and that pizza place that was full of screaming kids. It didn't look like much from the outside. Concrete brick walls stained from decades of cigarette smoke and spring thaws. A slightly angled roof to keep the snow from piling up in the winter. One-way windows only hinted at the warmth inside, backlit by a flickering neon Coors Light sign hanging above the glass door. Felix parked along the curve and gave me a nod before stepping out. I didn't move at first, exhausted in a way I couldn't even begin to explain. After a weak sigh, I followed him in. The bar was dimly lit, low-hanging lights casting long shadows across wood-beamed walls. A few regulars sat on worn vinyl stools, nursing nearly empty beers and clutching half-spent cigarettes. The thick scent of tobacco hit me like a punch to the gut. We passed through the vestibule into the main bar. A battered jukebox flickered quietly in the corner. Across the room, a doorway opened to a second space I couldn't quite see. A wood stove, untouched and cold in the summer months, leaned close to the doorway. Norm leaned against the back counter. The flashing Rainer sign behind him cast a dull red glow across his lined face as he wiped down a glass. Felix settled into his seat at the bar, but I didn't follow him, not yet. My gaze drifted to the jukebox as it quietly played For What It's Worth, but for some reason the usually calming twang of Buffalo Springfield didn't quite sit right with me. Not tonight. I quietly cycled through the different CDs, quickly noticing didn't have anything newer than 88. I grumbled softly as I cycled CDs to something my dad liked to listen to on the porch during the weekends. Gimme Shelter. I dug into my pocket for some loose change and fed the machine a pair of quarters. My gaze shifted as I noticed the dark form of a dog that you might call a lab if you squinted, lying across his warm bed next to the jukebox. I smiled softly as I watched this dog snore softly as he rested his blocky head on his paws. The jukebox started to play my song. The dog let out what I best could describe as a grumble as he lifted his graying muzzle to gaze up at me. His ears flicked as he squinted in what might be a judgmental stare at the jukebox as it played the Rolling Stones tune. I let myself smile as I kneeled down to him and softly scratched behind his floppy ears. "Did I wake you? I'm sorry, sweetheart." His tail thumped once on the tiled floor as he leaned into my hands with another grumble. I peered at his leather collar to see he shared the name of the beer of questionable quality, Bush. I let out a quiet chuckle, barely audible even to myself. I patted the lounging dog once more before standing up. As I walked back, I caught the gaze of one of the regulars just for a moment before he dropped his gaze to his beer. I didn't linger on this as I sat down at the bar next to Felix. Norm nodded at me as he poured Felix a draft. When he finished, he turned my way. Definitely a local through and through, mullet and handlebar stash, faded denim trucker's jacket, aviator-style glasses, a black hat with the outline of some Navy shit sat low on his head, the words USS Okinawa stitched across the front. "Evening, miss. What can I get you?" I hesitated a beat. Just a coffee." He raised a bushy eyebrow at the request, but didn't protest. "Black?" I nodded quietly. I didn't bother asking for cream or sugar, wasn't sure why I hadn't. Norm grabbed the old coffee pot, probably left simmering on the burner since this morning, and poured a mug of what smelled like the same brand they left out for us at the station. Burnt, bitter, and somehow still comforting. He set it down gently on the bar. I offered a soft thanks and let my eyes drift to the bottles lined up behind him. "I'll take a glass of wild turkey with it. Neat." Norm gave a small, unreadable nod and glanced over at Felix. The two men shared a look, brief but heavy, before he turned back and poured out the bourbon. He placed the glass beside the coffee with a soft clink. I murmured another thank you and without ceremony poured the contents of the glass straight into the mug. I cupped the plain ceramic in both hands, letting the heat soak into my palms before lifting it to my face. The scent hit me hard, scorched cheap coffee laced with a sharp bite of mid-shelf whiskey. I took a careful sip. The bitterness and the burn slid down my throat and bloomed warm in my chest. I let out a soft, strained exhale as the sting settled across the roof of my mouth, like I was breathing through the ache. I heard a soft grumble from behind me. I craned my head to see the dark form of the bartender's dog padding over from his bed. He plopped himself against my leg as he flopped over what I could best describe as a dog sigh. I smiled into the mug and leaned down and trailed my fingers along his forehead. He thumped his tail lazily in response. Felix looked over from his beer at the dog sprawled out on my foot chuckled a bit and said, "You must really like you." "Bush only gets up when you drop an egg," the bartender remarked as he stooped and dug through a mini fridge, bringing out a bright packet of Wonder Bread. I shrugged sheepishly and mumbled, "Guess he does." On the counter, 2 jars sat in cloudy liquid, eggs in one, jerky in the other. The brine was so murky it was hard to tell if the eggs had been there for weeks or years. Strips of meat looked handmade, maybe bison, maybe something else, something with too many tendons. The rack nearby sagged under greasy snack bags, but the fluorescent light above it flickered just enough to make the colors look wrong. The pickled sausages almost looked pink in the shifting light, like fingers in vinegar. The old cigarette machine crouched against the paneling, a faded Cool's logo glowing faintly above it. No buttons, just brass pole knobs dulled to a sickly bronze. A paper label above the slot warned $3.50, quarters only. The ink blurred from years of greasy hands. Behind the warped glass, the packs looked swollen and pale, their colors leached away, brands barely legible through the plastic haze. I looked over at Felix as he nursed his lager. He clutched the half-full glass tightly. Even now I could see his fingers trembling from the aftershock. He wasn't even looking at me, whether because he felt like I needed space or he didn't even know what to say at this point. I couldn't tell. His gaze was focused on the only TV in the bar. A blocky CRT behind the bar played a game show that looked familiar, though I couldn't quite name it. A glamorous blonde in heels and a sparkly red dress moving with the kind of easy practiced grace that made it look effortless. She walked through the glowing panels, flipping them one by one as the audience applauded every nervous guess. The woman was beautiful, tall, slim, with the kind of posture that probably took a lifetime to learn. The tinny bar speakers couldn't keep up with the can clapping and chimes, but it didn't matter. She held the screen just fine without sound. "You ever wear a dress like that, Ash?" Felix said, still nursing his beer. I let out a soft snort. "Please, I don't have legs like hers." Felix chuckled and gave his glass a small tilt. "Didn't break any hearts back home, Miss San Diego?" I shook my head, a little quieter now. "Me and dating never really worked out. Not exactly a looker." "Hasn't stopped the new volunteers from running into trees around you," he said with a chiding smile. "They're just dumb kids, Felix," I dismissed with a wave of my hand. "Kids can be pretty honest, Ash," he replied matter-of-factly. "Shut up, old man," I grumbled, hiding a forming smile behind my mug as I took a sip. I quickly caught a familiar smell, the kind that drifts through dorm kitchens back home in UCSD. The aroma of a grilled cheese browning on a hot pan. Glancing over, I spotted the bartender cooking a pair of sandwiches on a hot plate, tucked into a tiny corner beside a plain white microwave and a toaster oven. He slid 2 paper plates silently across the bar, one with a freshly made grilled cheese for me, the other a classic hangover special, fried bologna and cheese. I don't even remember asking for them. "I didn't order," I started quietly, but the handlebar mustache bartender cut me off. "Eat, girl, you two look like hell." When I asked how much he wanted for them, he just grunted and walked off, busying himself and ignoring my question. I looked over at Felix for help and only got a sheepish smile and a pat on the shoulder. I looked down at the sandwich and accepted my fate as I started to peel off the crusts by hand. I looked down at my feet to see Bush still snoring away softly. I bent down and offered him some of the crusts. I felt the warm breath against my hand as he sniffed it. Without opening his eyes, he gently took it from my hand and chomped away. I smiled softly as I fed him the rest of the peeled crusts. I took a few bites and let myself sink a little further into that bar stool. Just as I was beginning to relax, I heard a sound that I normally didn't pay any attention to, but this time it made my spine tense like a bear trap snapping shut. The sound of rotors cutting through the temperate summer air. Through the windows I saw the shape of a helicopter flying low, sweeping the tree line. his spotlight searching for any movement in the brush, the strobes flashing dimly as the red and greens of its directional lights glowed steadily. The windows of the bar began to shake as the engine shrilled as it drowned out any sounds of warmth. The dark form of the bar dog raised his head and stared out at that chopper. He didn't make a sound as he watched it comb the tree lines. His ears perked and his eyes focused. The chopper finally turned, and that's when I saw dim blue light illuminating a golden star and black writing that read Montana Highway Patrol. It started to gain altitude as it passed over the bar with a shriek, the rumbling of the spinning blades shaking my very core. In the distant interstate, I could gaze out and see the red and blues flashing wildly as the shapes of emergency vehicles tearing down the highway towards the woods. The howling of the sirens echoing in the distance. I felt a hand grab my shoulder, but I couldn't look away. I didn't say much after that. I finished my drink and noticed Felix had already paid the tab before I could react. We just exchanged a look and we both knew we wanted to leave. We bid a muffled farewell to Norm as we exited the bar. The streets of Ravenwood still carried the distant shrill calls of the sirens deep within the woods. Felix offered to drive me home. He didn't exactly have any reason to say no to him. I wish I could say something else happened on the drive back, but nothing did. I just remember staring out at nothing in particular as we passed the shadowy forms of closed storefronts and isolated houses. When we finally pulled into the small collection of staff cabins, he turned to me as he was about to make his farewell, but I stopped him as I could feel my hands starting to shake again. "Can you stay? Just till morning?" Felix looked at me in surprise for a moment before softening his expression. "You sure?" I nodded and he let out an exhale. "Alright, I'll crash on the couch." I smiled a little, feeling a little safer that I wouldn't be alone tonight, despite his hesitation to stay. As we both went inside the little cabin, I took in the familiar scent of cheap wood as I tried to make myself at home. A cabin was a strong word. It wasn't like those polished cabins you saw on the lakeside with handmade wooden furniture marketed as a romantic getaway for couples. It was basically a shack with a tiny kitchen and stuff of furniture from the 70s that the feds bought for cheap, and a cot with a blue mattress that looked like it had been dragged from Camp Pendleton. Felix settled on the ugly yellow and green plaid couch that I internally gagged every time I set my eyes on it. I took a short shower that somewhat dampened the smell of ammonia lingering on my skin before getting ready for bed. I changed into some comfy shorts and a loose-fitting tank top and finally let my hair down. The rancid smell now being replaced by the stale air and musty upholstery. I looked over at Felix as he lounged in his makeshift sleeping spot on the sofa, eyeing the CRT adorned with bunny ears. His eyes flickered to me as I stood there in my pajamas. "Heading to bed?" "Yeah, Felix, The experienced ranger sat up to fully regard me as he could infer I was about to say something I had been wanting to say for a while. "Thank you for everything tonight. If you hadn't been there, I probably wouldn't be..." He stopped me from continuing, already knowing where I was going with this. "Ashley, there's nothing good that will come from thinking about what could have happened." "I know," I say, letting out a deep sigh. "I'll be here, alright? Just try to get some sleep on." "Right. Night, Felix." "Night, Ash." I padded off to the little bedroom they had and tried to get comfortable in bed. The dark green wool blanket from the surplus store smelled like mothballs and not much else, but somehow it didn't make me as itchy like it usually did. I lay there for what felt like hours, my eyes just trying to drift away into sleep after this hellish day, but despite my best efforts, my fatigue wouldn't take me. I couldn't stop thinking about that thing in the woods, its endless teeth as it opened its horrific jaws, the way it thrashed and twitched after Felix shot it, the smell that clung to my uniform and my skin. I sat up, rubbing my face, the images of what I saw not leaving my mind. Giving up on sleep entirely, I climbed out of bed and wandered into the dimly lit common area. Felix still sat on the couch, wrapped up in a fleece blanket as the washy colors from the Phillips brushed over his exhausted face. The CRT quietly murmured a late-night rerun of Are You Being Served? I made my way over to him and sat close by him as the sitcom whispered a canned laugh track. "Can't sleep?" he said without looking at me. I shook my head and he smiled almost sadly. "Yeah, me neither," he said with a heavy sigh. I didn't say anything, but without thinking, I found myself leaning on him, as I felt myself start to shiver, but not from the cold. As the actors on screen, marinated in hairspray, rattled out British cultural references and jokes from the 70s I didn't understand, I felt the blanket being draped around me, just like I did for Jess. The fridge buzzing in the background became the only backdrop besides the TV set. I didn't know when I fell asleep on Felix's shoulder, but whatever small comfort he brought seemed to be enough to lull me into a surprisingly restful slumber. If I had any nightmares that night, they burned away from my memory as soon as the sun rose above the horizon. When the morning finally washed over us, I felt myself making a breakfast and back home that brought a little comfort to me. Rancheros huevos. Despite Felix looking at it strangely, he ate it without protest and said it reminded him of Indian tacos, though I wasn't sure what that even was, but it was nice to cook for someone again. After breakfast, Felix drove me back to the station to pick up my car. Before we parted ways, I embraced him for what felt like hours, but in reality it probably only lasted a couple seconds. He told me to stay out of trouble, but I couldn't look him in the eye when I said I would. Instead of just leaving in my car to wallow at what happened last night, I found myself drawn to those swinging glass doors of that shabby ranger station. Every part of me just told me to leave it to the pros. I'm just a college girl who works here seasonally. What good could I possibly do after what happened? Despite all these doubts circling like a tornado, my legs marched towards those double doors, but I know I could never forgive myself if I left. Despite how much busier the station was than usual, I slipped past most of the rangers without any of them even asking where I was going. Phones seemed to be ringing on end as badge rangers with rifles over their shoulders hauled heavy trunks of gear in and out of the station like worker ants. I stopped in front of Jake's office, realizing this was my last chance to turn back. I rested my knuckles on the polished wooden door before rapping my fist 3 times on it. I heard a tired murmur to enter. The scent of cheap tobacco hit me as soon as I entered the cluttered office. Jake sat behind his desk, eyes bloodshot as he cradled a landline across his neck. He lazily blew out plumes of smoke through the half-cracked window at his side. His eyes flickered to me as he gestured to the chair in front of his desk, bidding me to sit. He clenched his jaw as he listened to what was said on the other end. His fist balling on the corded line, he let out a deep sigh before muttering a thank you into the receiver before hanging up. His hand rubbed his face as he attempted to smooth over his disheveled hair. My eyes flickered to the mug bearing the arrow-like mark of the Forestry Service. Many rings of stale coffee colored the inside as a few drops of tar that had long since gone cold lingered at the bottom. "I can come back later if now is a bad time," I offered almost sheepishly, like I was letting down my favorite professor. He shook his head into his hand before letting it rest on the desk as he flickered excess ash into a stained ashtray. "I'm sure you're here because you want to leave. Well, I can get you a ticket home, probably next week, and I can call in a favor, get you paid still for this season." "No," I said almost weakly, rejecting the tempting offer. Jake furrowed his brow as he took a long drag from his cigarette. "Then why are you—" "I want to go out there. For the search," I stated almost plainly. My supervisor's expression softened as he glazed up at me. "Ashley, you don't have to do this. You've done plenty already." I shook my head slightly as I continued to make my case. I know. I'm sorry. He waved his hand almost dismissively. You have nothing to be sorry for. I know what you saw last night. No one will think any less of you if you bow now. I can't. I replied, my ability to form complete sentences seemed to lessen as the conversation continued on. You sure you want to do this? I took a deep breath, despite the persistent cigarette smoke making my nose wrinkle. I'm sure. Look, they found a body of one of them on tribal land, nailed into a tree this morning. This isn't just a dumb group of hikers getting lost. You can still back out of this. A lump settled in my throat as I could only imagine the carnage. When I didn't say anything, Jake stamped out his half-finished cigarette in the ashtray and slid his chair over to the metal filing cabinet and dug through for a particular folder. He set it out on the desk as he gently guided me on what to sign and what to fill out. Alright, you're going there armed. It's not a question anymore. You'll be with Stephanie. She's a badge ranger. She's been around longer than me. She knows what she's doing. Thanks, Jake, I said, managing to force a soft but strained smile in his direction. Sure, just stay close to Steph, alright, kid? I don't want one of us being next. I felt a deep weight burrow into my chest cavity at his final warning, but instead I meekly thanked him and got ready for what may lay ahead. Jake gave me a folded map, its corners already creased, showing the search area and the location of the main base camp, before sending me on my way after I packed my bag. Don't get yourself killed to prove a point, he added as he walked me outside, the glass door slamming behind him as he retreated back into the confines of that chaotic station. I found myself on the road once again as my Chevy rumbled along. The base camp, if you could call it that, was basically just a collection of tents and cars made into a little village of what was once a dirt lot for a junction of trailheads. It was a collection of everyone you could think of. Wildland fire crews in bright Nomex shirts and soot-stained red hard hats moved in neat lines, shovels and pole skis balanced across their shoulders. Nearby, volunteers lounged in ranch jackets and hunting gear, their lever actions and bolt rifles propped against camp chairs as they traded quiet small talk over steaming thermoses. At the center of it all, grim-faced rangers and game wardens crowded around whiteboards and pinned maps spread across folding tables, boots still dusty from the trails, rifles slung over their shoulders as they studied the lines of the terrain. I walked over to the group of rangers as I scanned the crowd for Stephanie. Of course, it wasn't that hard to notice her. She stood apart from the others. The ranger leaned on the hood of her truck, campaign cover canted low over her face, her sun-cut jawline silhouetted in the late morning light. Her pack and rifle rested on the tire as he drew neat lines on a map with a protractor. I walked over with my framed pack hanging over my shoulder. Stephanie tilted her chin to gaze at me as I approached. A few strands of silver slipped across her tanned temple. The corner of her lip curled as she regarded me. So you're the greenhorn Jake is making me babysit. I rubbed the back of my neck before straightening myself up. I just want to help, I admitted with a forced smile as I fiddled with my pack straps. Help, huh? Alright, grab that radio. We're heading out. She pointed at a spare boxy radio she had lying next to her pack. I awkwardly clipped it onto my old brown belt and fiddled with the unfamiliar shoulder mic before the older ranger let out a almost amused huff. She stomped over as she murmured at me to let go. Her hands worked quickly as she clipped it onto my uniform shirt properly. I sheepishly smiled at her and thanked her. She slipped on a high-vis vest and donned her pack. So, where are we going? I finally asked. Stephanie adjusted her rifle's sling as she flashed a self-assured smile. Ain't you eager? We're just gonna be walking the line the hand crews cleared for us. Nothing crazy. Right, I said, gazing out the newly carved trail. Got everything? Water, flares, whistle, map and compass. Six shooter, bear spray, med kits. She listed all off almost coldly as she walked forward with her rifle pointing at the dirt. I nodded, almost slightly relieved that I had taken some time to properly pack for this. Stephanie led the way through the line. The makeshift trail was covered in upturned dirt. Small dead trees from destroyed brush peeked out of the soil. Lines of neatly raised earth flanked either side with a surgical clear cut. I was quietly impressed at the precision, but didn't voice it out loud. Steph walked just ahead of me as a large can of bear spray bounced on her hip, with a fearsome revolver that was much bigger than mine, resting in a well-loved holster. We spent most of the day walking the route, checking for any signs of any activity that didn't come from the team. I felt myself sweating in the summer heat as we hiked along. At around 3, we dropped packs and took a water break and ate some lunch. It was mostly just jerky and whatever trail mix we brought with us. We only continued on a bit longer before the sun started to fall and shadows began to lengthen. But it wasn't quite dusk yet. It was around 4 or so, I think. Stephanie tapped her watch and told her we ought to head back before it gets dark. I didn't offer any protest as we began to walk back. We honestly didn't talk much the whole day. To be honest, I don't think she liked me very much. Probably just doing this for Jake as a favor or something. As I was about to get fully swallowed into my thoughts, I noticed just how quiet it had gotten again. Like a mountain lion was watching me and the birds knew it. Stephanie quickened her pace and told me to keep up. I didn't want to know why. I smelled something that made me stop dead in my tracks and made my entire body rush with a sudden shot of adrenaline coursing into my veins. The scent of ammonia. Steph, I tried to say, but she cut me off. Keep walking, she said in a measured but tight voice. The smell only got worse as we continued the march along. It was almost unbearable now. Nausea began to take hold of my senses. Suddenly I heard what seemed to be the sound of branches snapping and thrashing, not like the tiny ones you might find on the forest floor, but the long and sturdy tree limbs high above the ground. I noticed something lumbering across the corner of my eye. I turned my head to look and quickly regretted it. Before I could make a sound, Stephanie's hand went over my mouth. I looked over at her to see her staring out at the tree line, her jaw tight. Steph's eyes were like orbs of steel, hardened and focused at the task ahead. With much hesitation, I finally followed her gaze. Skittering with an unnatural gait between the trees, which more resembled a nightmare than an animal. It seemed to be made of borrowed limbs, heads of creatures I knew very well, formed into a spider-like shape, towering over the young fir trees. Steph slowly released her hand from my mouth as she continued to focus on this abomination. Don't run now, hon. It will chase you down faster than a grizzly with cubs, she whispered gravely to me. My breath hitched in my throat as the sound of my heart pounding in my ears almost drowned out every other sound around me. I slowly drew my shaking hand to my holster, but Steph stopped me with a firm squeeze to my shoulder. Don't. That little pea shooter would just piss it off, she murmured to me as that thing snapped another heavy branch from its mast, brushing against an evergreen with a loud snap. My eyes flickered to the rifle in her experienced hands as my knees turned to jelly. What do we do? Can't you just shoot it? I whispered shakily to her. She turned her head ever so slightly in my direction. She grinned almost amusedly and let out a soft giggle. Oh, bless your heart. This 308 wouldn't put down something this big. Speaking of... She trailed off as she suddenly offered the rifle to me. Hold this for a second. Don't shoot it. As the heavy rifle was thrust awkwardly into my hands, I stood there almost cluelessly. What? What are you doing? I almost demanded as the creature's wolf head canted almost unnaturally to stare at us. Its gums pulled back into a snarl. Just trust me, Ashley. Stay real still now. she said firmly as she reached across her belt and drew a bulky metallic flare pistol. Not like those little shitty orange plastic ones you might find in a regular emergency kit, but the type you might find on a Coast Guard cutter. The ranger flipped open the signal pistol, almost absent-mindedly, as she dug into a small compartment on her belt and thumbed in a flare shell. With a soft thump, she closed it and took a few steps forward and spread her feet. The thing's heads now focused all their pure white eyes on us. In unison, it opened its maws and let out an unholy cacophony of sounds that I had heard before. A wolf's howl at the moon, a raven's croak and caw, the shrill scream of a mountain lioness in heat, the almost rhythmic bellow of a bull elk in early spring, the mesmerizing song of a loon out on the lake. All these sounds seemed to echo in unison at the back of my skull as they shook the earth. The symphony pounded in my chest as it traveled out my entire body. My ears rang absent-mindedly as I tightened my grip on the useless rifle. Just as the calls ended, I heard the click of the flare pistol's hammer being pulled back. That sounded almost deafening, but I didn't know why. The ranger let out a sharp exhale as she finally brought the flare pistol to bear. That thing began to charge towards us as it strafed between trees, the trunks rumbling from its weight as its clawed and cloven hooves dug into the bark for leverage. A loud crack tore through the air and I flinched. A wave of ringing dulled my hearing. A smoke trail hung in the air as the flare slammed into the creature with a fleshy thud. A muted pop followed almost like a firework, then a savage hiss as it ignited. The forest filled with the stench of burning fur and gunpowder. The flare burned like a sun as that thing screamed and thrashed, its disproportional limbs scrambling through the soil as it skidded away faster than an ATV, the signal round still burning red hot against its flesh as it fled. The cries of agony faded into the distant echoes as the trees swallowed its form, while the pounding of my heart and the ringing in my ears dominated my senses. The older ranger stood still for a moment before turning the smoking signal pistol over and dumping the spent shell. Her washed-out voice murmured something to me, but I only stared blankly at her as she carefully retrieved the rifle from my death grip. Her hand wrapped around my arm as she dragged me back towards the camp. She didn't offer any explanation or waste any words trying to reassure me in the moment. The sun only fell further behind the horizon as the twilight descended upon us. The trail shifted as it paralleled the nearby highway. Ahead, a line of dark patrol cars blocked the road, their light bars burning, fused into a makeshift barrier. A state trooper in a crisp tan uniform stood in front with a shotgun across his chest, his campaign hat silhouetted against the glow. The lawman carved a wide circle in the air with his mag light. Lines of confused, road-tripping families, packed into wood-paneled station wagons and minivans, reluctantly took the graveled crossover and sped back down the interstate. Other troopers lingered by their cruisers, sweeping spotlights through the trees. Stephanie and I exchanged a glance and let out an exhausted sigh. "Come on, ain't no use staring. Let's get you something to eat back at camp," she said gently, but her voice carried a tightness that I hadn't heard before. When we reached camp, we settled around our little fire we set up for the night. The ranger settled in her folding chair, now with her hat resting on her knee. Her silver-streaked bun now loosened as she brought a cigarette to her lips. Just before she could light it, it tumbled out of her hands. Her fingers shook as she let out a soft curse and balled her hand into a fist. I observed this, but didn't say anything as I heated up some ramen over a sterno. I let out an exhale before finally speaking up, trying to keep my voice steady. How can you be so calm about this?" Steph's silver eyes focused on me as she lit up her retrieved Zippo. "You get used to it," she said almost dismissively as she took a long drag. "That's it? You just get used to it?" I asked incredulously. Well, before all this happened, us badge folk didn't exactly do what y'all seasonals do and go home. You ever been up to Yellowstone? Maybe once, I think, I replied, raising an eyebrow, wondering where this was going. You know those thermal pools? She asked, and I responded with a nod as she took a long drag before continuing. Yeah, so back in 81, when I was a young, pretty thing like you, had this couple go off the trail into the pools to find somewhere to skinny dip, and Yeah, I said with a sigh as I rubbed my neck. I'm sure, she says with a wiry smile. Well, the boyfriend gets close to test the water and he falls right in. Didn't even scream much, but she sure did when she ran to get us. Was he dead? Well, I wish that's all he was, she says with a soft but empty smile on her suntanned face. Jesus, I muttered to myself. By the time we got there, the pool was like sludge that reeked like pennies. There were nothing to pull out besides a few clumps of hair and some ripped up cloth and that smell. They must have closed the park, I mused out loud as I stared at the floating block of instant noodles in my mess cup. The ranger across from me grinned like a shark, but it didn't reach her eyes. Think so? Ain't you sweet? Nah, all they did was add another sign, and that was that. Family tried to sue, but got dismissed. That's awful, I said, not really sure what else to even say. Steph agreed with a nod before continuing on. Sure, but it's just another thing to deal with, just like the Chimera, the bears, and the tourists. The Chimera? I said, finally looking up. That's what we call it, like that old Greek story. Thing has been prowling since last April. First, it took a hunter in his deer stand, then a hiker here and there. Those drunk kids are probably next. At this point, they're probably all dead. She stated flatly with self-assurance plainly heard. How can this happen? Why don't they shut the park down? Stephanie finally softened her expression as her gaze met mine. I wonder that too, most nights. I didn't respond as I stared at the campfire crackling and popping in the night. The woman let out a plume of smoke before sagging her shoulders. Ash, honey, you should get some rest. You had a long day, she said with a gentler tone. I managed to smile and muffled goodnight before plopping myself in one of the foldable cots for the night. For some reason, I was able to actually sleep better tonight. I wasn't really sure why, but I didn't really care. I wish I could say that would be my worst night so far, but I would later be proven wrong once again.